Monday, 5 June 1944, began with low clouds hanging over southern England as World War II approached one of its decisive moments, and within the vast Allied force preparing for invasion, there existed tensions and contradictions that had little to do with German defenses and everything to do with how the United States Army viewed its own soldiers, especially those who did not fit long-standing assumptions about race, discipline, and control. General George S. Patton was at this time one of the most closely watched commanders in the Allied camp, admired for his aggressive instincts and feared for his volatility. And while his public image centered on speed, armor, and relentless offense, his private correspondence and command behavior revealed deep anxieties about order, reputation, and the unpredictable consequences of unleashing forces he believed the institution was not prepared to fully accept. Among those forces were Black American soldiers trained for combat roles but constrained by segregationist policy, soldiers who had been labeled dangerous, uncontrollable, or excessively aggressive not because of battlefield evidence but because of entrenched racial beliefs embedded within the U.S. Army long before World War II began. The phrase "ruthless" was not one these soldiers used to describe themselves, but it circulated within officer conversations as a coded expression of fear, reflecting concern that Black troops, if exposed to sustained combat against German forces known for brutality, might respond with uncompromising force that senior leaders worried would attract scrutiny or disrupt diplomatic narratives. Patton's own worldview had been shaped by a rigid belief in hierarchy and tradition, and while he respected fighting ability above nearly all else, he also believed discipline had to be absolute, controlled from the top down, and visibly enforceable, a belief that clashed with how the Army itself undermined discipline by segregating units and denying equal authority to Black officers. In World War II, Black American soldiers were disproportionately assigned to labor, logistics, and service roles, not because of lack of capability, but because Army leadership feared the consequences of arming men whom society itself refused to treat as equals, creating a paradox in which courage was demanded but autonomy was denied. Patton was not unique in this mindset, but his bluntness makes the tension easier to trace. He believed war stripped away illusions and revealed raw human behavior, and in that belief he assumed that men already subjected to injustice might fight with a ferocity that the institution could neither openly acknowledge nor easily control. This fear did not arise from evidence of battlefield misconduct by Black units, but from pre-war racial theories taught at military academies and reinforced by decades of segregated service. Theories that World War II would steadily expose as false through repeated performance under fire. As the Army expanded rapidly after 1941, thousands of Black Americans volunteered or were drafted, trained to fight for a country that denied them basic civil rights, and many of these men demonstrated discipline, cohesion, and restraint equal to or exceeding that of white units placed under similar stress. Yet commanders like Patton operated within a system where perception mattered as much as reality, and the fear was not that Black soldiers would be ineffective, but that they would be too effective in ways that contradicted the carefully managed moral image the Allies sought to project during World War II. Rumors circulated within command circles that if Black combat troops were pushed too hard or placed in sustained frontline roles, they might retaliate against SS units or refuse to take prisoners, rumors unsupported by data but persistent enough to shape deployment decisions. These concerns mirrored similar anxieties expressed during World War I, when Black units fighting under French command earned distinction, while American leadership remained reluctant to fully integrate them, a pattern repeated in World War II, despite the vastly different scale and stakes of the conflict. Patton's apprehension was therefore institutional rather than personal, rooted in a belief that the Army lacked the cultural tools to manage black combat soldiers without attracting political backlash at home or controversy abroad, especially as Allied leaders emphasized liberation and justice as core justifications for World War II. This contradiction placed black soldiers in an impossible position, trained to fight, but distrusted when they demonstrated the willingness to do so, disciplined when they demanded equal treatment, but praised quietly when they exceeded expectations. Within segregated training camps, black soldiers were often subjected to harsher discipline, closer surveillance, and fewer opportunities for advancement, conditions that produced not recklessness but professionalism, hardened by constant scrutiny. When some of these soldiers were finally given combat roles late in World War II, including armored, artillery, and infantry assignments, their performance undermined nearly every assumption that had kept them sidelined. Patton himself would later rely on black units in moments of crisis, particularly when manpower shortages forced commanders to prioritize ability over ideology, revealing that fear had always been secondary to necessity. The idea that Patton was afraid to send black soldiers into battle must therefore be understood not as fear of their weakness, but fear of what their success would expose about the Army's own contradictions. World War II forced the United States to confront the gap between democratic ideals and military practice, and black soldiers stood at the center of that confrontation, their service challenging narratives the institution had long protected. They were not ruthless by nature, but they were resolute, and in a war defined by mechanized slaughter and ideological extremism, resolve itself was often mischaracterized as something dangerous when it came from those denied full belonging. As preparations for liberation intensified, the pressure to use every available capable soldier grew, and the distance between fear and necessity narrowed, setting the stage for decisions that would quietly reshape the Army from within during the final phases of World War II. As Allied forces moved from preparation into execution, the contradiction between policy and reality became impossible to ignore. Because World War II was not a conflict that allowed unused strength to sit idle, and commanders were increasingly judged not by ideology, but by results measured in ground taken, units preserved, and momentum maintained. By late 1944, casualty rates among frontline formations were forcing the U.S. Army to confront manpower shortages that no amount of training schedules or recruitment slogans could solve, and this pressure pushed previously sidelined black soldiers closer to combat roles that segregationist doctrine had long denied them. The Army's internal reports began to show a pattern that contradicted earlier fears, revealing that black units placed under combat conditions demonstrated discipline comparable to white units, and in some cases exhibited higher cohesion precisely because they had been conditioned to operate under constant scrutiny. Patton, whose reputation depended on relentless offensive action, was acutely aware that hesitation killed armies faster than enemy fire, and while his personal beliefs about race remained rigid, his operational instincts increasingly overrode institutional caution as World War II entered its most unforgiving phase. The irony was that the very traits once labeled dangerous became invaluable when German resistance stiffened, as endurance, aggression, and refusal to break under pressure were precisely the qualities required to sustain armored thrusts across hostile terrain. Black tank crews, artillerymen, and infantry replacements were often thrown into gaps created by casualties, receiving less preparation time than white counterparts, yet adapting rapidly under fire, a reality that quietly unsettled long-standing assumptions within the officer corps. Reports from the front began to note not recklessness, but restraint, with black soldiers adhering to rules of engagement and command authority, despite the stress of prolonged exposure to combat conditions that tested every soldier's limits in World War II. The fear that these men would act outside command control proved unfounded, but the fear that their competence would expose systemic injustice proved justified, because success left no room for excuses. Patton's own reliance on effectiveness meant that once a unit proved itself, he rarely interfered, and in this way, battlefield necessity forced a gradual, if unacknowledged, shift in how black soldiers were employed under his command. This shift did not translate into public praise or institutional reform at the time, but it altered internal perceptions in subtle ways that would later influence post-war evaluations and historical reassessments of World War II service. The myth of inherent instability collapsed under the weight of daily operations, supply convoys protected, positions held, and counterattacks repelled by men who had been deemed too risky to trust with responsibility. At the same time, the Army remained careful about optics, ensuring that recognition was muted and that narratives of integration did not challenge the segregated structure still firmly in place.
Black soldiers understood this contradiction intimately, fighting with the knowledge that excellence might secure survival and unit respect, but not equality, a reality that shaped their conduct and reinforced professionalism rather than resentment. The longer the war continued, the more obvious it became that the true risk had never been the soldiers themselves, but the assumptions that had delayed their full use while costing time, lives, and operational flexibility. World War II rewarded adaptability, and institutions slow to adapt paid for it in blood, a lesson repeated across theaters as commanders were forced to abandon outdated doctrines under pressure. Patton's fears, when examined through this lens, reveal more about the Army's internal anxieties than about the soldiers it distrusted, because those anxieties stemmed from a system unwilling to reconcile democratic rhetoric with segregated reality. As combat dragged on without pause, the distinction between trusted and untrusted troops blurred under the shared conditions of exhaustion, danger, and dependence that defined the front lines. In these conditions, identity mattered less than reliability, and reliability became impossible to deny when tested repeatedly under fire. The experiences of black combat soldiers during this phase of World War II did not overturn segregation immediately, but they eroded its intellectual foundation, replacing theory with evidence that could no longer be dismissed privately, even if it remained unacknowledged publicly. What remained unresolved was not whether these soldiers could fight, but whether the nation they served was prepared to confront what their service revealed about itself. As the campaign pressed deeper into contested territory, the operational tempo of World War II left little space for ideological consistency, because artillery schedules, fuel consumption, and casualty evacuation timetables demanded immediate solutions rather than philosophical debates about who should or should not be trusted with lethal responsibility. Within Patton's command structure, logistics officers began to recognize that the success of forward units increasingly depended on support formations staffed largely by black soldiers, whose ability to maintain supply flow under fire directly influenced whether armored spearheads stalled or advanced. The Red Ball Express, often described in sanitized terms after the war, was in reality a brutal test of endurance, navigation, and nerve, where drivers operated day and night under blackout conditions, mechanical failure, and the constant threat of ambush, yet maintained delivery rates that defied initial projections. These contributions did not occur in isolation, because every gallon of fuel delivered and every artillery shell unloaded altered the tactical possibilities available to frontline commanders, making support roles an invisible form of combat that shaped outcomes as decisively as direct engagement. Patton understood momentum better than most generals, and momentum depended on uninterrupted movement, which in turn depended on men who could be relied upon to perform monotonous, dangerous tasks without recognition, a reality that forced a grudging reliance on black units across multiple echelons. In World War II, the line between combat and support was often theoretical rather than practical, because enemy artillery did not discriminate between infantry and truck convoys, and air attacks targeted supply routes precisely because they sustained offensive action. Black engineers repairing bridges under fire, clearing minefields, and maintaining roads ensured that armored columns could continue advancing, even as their own vulnerability matched that of any frontline unit. The Army's own data began to reflect this reality, showing that failure rates, disciplinary incidents, and desertion statistics among black units did not exceed those of white units when conditions were comparable, undermining claims that segregation was necessary for effectiveness. Despite this, official doctrine lagged behind operational reality, preserving segregation as a structural norm while quietly expanding the responsibilities assigned to black soldiers out of necessity rather than conviction. This contradiction produced a peculiar dynamic in which black soldiers were entrusted with increasingly critical missions while remaining excluded from the recognition systems that validated service within the military hierarchy. Patton's leadership style, defined by urgency and intolerance for delay, meant that once a unit demonstrated competence, he was unlikely to replace it regardless of race, because inefficiency threatened his broader strategic objectives in World War II. Yet this reliance did not translate into advocacy, as Patton compartmentalized effectiveness and ideology, allowing one to override the other without requiring reconciliation between them. For the soldiers themselves, this environment demanded a form of discipline that extended beyond tactical execution, requiring emotional restraint in the face of contradictions that would have broken less cohesive formations. They operated knowing that errors would confirm prejudice, while success would often be attributed to circumstance rather than capability, a psychological burden that shaped behavior under pressure. The persistence of segregation also meant that lessons learned in combat were rarely transmitted upward in a way that challenged institutional assumptions, because acknowledging them would have required re-evaluating policy at the highest levels. World War II thus became a proving ground, not only for weapons and tactics, but for the validity of long-held beliefs about race, authority, and military efficiency. As the fighting intensified, casualty replacement systems increasingly funneled black soldiers into depleted units, creating mixed realities in which segregation existed administratively, while integration occurred functionally on the battlefield. These improvised solutions exposed the artificial nature of rigid separation, revealing that combat effectiveness depended far more on training, leadership, and cohesion than on racial composition. The longer the war continued, the harder it became to justify the disparity between responsibility and recognition, as evidence accumulated through daily operations rather than formal declarations. By the final phases of major campaigns, the presence of black soldiers in roles once deemed unsuitable had become routine, not because policy changed, but because reality demanded adaptation. What remained unresolved was the question of what would happen when the shooting stopped, and whether the lessons learned under fire would survive the transition from necessity to memory in the aftermath of World War II.
When combat operations slowed in certain sectors, reports flowed back through headquarters channels that quietly documented performance metrics, maintenance outputs, and delivery rates, forming an empirical record that contradicted long-standing assumptions without ever stating so explicitly. In World War II, institutional memory was shaped less by official proclamations than by after-action reports, and within those documents, the consistent reliability of black units appeared again and again, embedded in statistics that were difficult to dismiss, even if uncomfortable to acknowledge. Senior officers reviewing these reports often framed success in neutral terms, attributing outcomes to circumstance or leadership, rather than examining how segregation itself imposed inefficiencies that had been mitigated only through improvisation. The battlefield thus became an unintentional laboratory where preconceived ideas were tested against reality and where results accumulated regardless of whether anyone intended to learn from them. For black soldiers, this meant that excellence was not a path to advancement, but a requirement for survival, because failure carried consequences beyond the individual,
reinforcing stereotypes that policymakers use to justify exclusion. The psychological discipline required to operate under such scrutiny was itself a form of endurance, as men learned to suppress frustration in order to maintain cohesion within units that were evaluated more harshly than others. In the closing months of World War II, as Allied forces pushed toward final objectives, manpower shortages intensified, forcing commanders to draw from every available pool, regardless of earlier reservations. This pressure accelerated the informal integration already occurring at the margins, where necessity erased distinctions that doctrine insisted upon maintaining.
As occupation planning began even before the final offensives concluded, military planners faced the uncomfortable task of translating wartime improvisation back into peacetime structure, a process that risked erasing the operational truths learned during World War II in favor of familiar hierarchies. Reports compiled during the conflict documented the performance of black units in transportation, engineering, ordnance, and increasingly in combat-adjacent roles. Yet these documents were often filed as logistical data rather than interpreted as evidence of systemic capability. The Army's personnel system, built for segregation, struggled to reconcile the fact that thousands of black soldiers had already functioned beyond the narrow definitions assigned to them before the war began. In field hospitals and replacement depots, racial boundaries blurred under pressure as wounded soldiers were treated side by side and replacements were assigned based on immediate need rather than ideological preference. Commanders who had once resisted black units found themselves quietly requesting them again, not as an experiment, but as a known quantity, trusted to deliver results under conditions where failure carried strategic consequences. World War II thus created a gap between official language and operational behavior, with the latter evolving faster than doctrine could acknowledge. Training manuals remained conservative even as battlefield necessity forced innovation, revealing how institutions adapt first through action and only later through policy, if at all. For black soldiers, the end of combat did not bring clarity because demobilization raised questions about whether their wartime service would alter their status within the military or society at large. Many returned from Europe and the Pacific, having operated complex machinery, led men under fire, and sustained operations under conditions that demanded discipline equal to any elite unit. Yet the administrative processes awaiting them reflected pre-war assumptions, not wartime realities, reinforcing the sense that their contributions existed in a parallel record rarely consulted by decision-makers. Within veteran communities, shared experiences forged bonds that crossed racial lines, even as official narratives attempted to reimpose separation through selective memory. The contradiction was evident in award citations, where collective achievements were praised while individual recognition lagged, creating a historical imbalance that would take decades to address. World War II left behind an archive filled with after-action reports, supply logs, and casualty lists that told a story of reliance and performance, even when public commemoration did not. As the Army evaluated its future force structure, pressures from emerging global tensions made it increasingly difficult to justify inefficiency, pushing practical considerations back into conflict with inherited beliefs. The experience of sustained global warfare had demonstrated that modern armies function as systems, where the failure of any component, regardless of who staffed it, threatened the whole. This understanding slowly filtered upward, not through speeches or proclamations, but through the accumulated weight of evidence generated by years of uninterrupted operations. By the late stages of occupation duty, some commanders began to articulate what had previously gone unsaid, acknowledging that segregation had imposed limitations rather than safeguards. These acknowledgments were rarely public, but they circulated within professional military education settings, influencing younger officers whose careers would extend beyond World War II.
The war had reshaped not only battlefields, but assumptions, and even where resistance remained, it had become harder to argue against results recorded in numbers, timelines, and outcomes. What followed would depend on whether institutions could confront their own records honestly, or whether the lessons earned at such cost would be quietly archived, awaiting rediscovery by another generation facing similar contradictions.